For Catholics and within the Catholic Church, the Deuterocanonical books are not second-class citizens. They do not have a secondary status of inspiration, and they are not theologically less important than the so-called proto-canonical books. So Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, they are fully inspired, just like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they are theologically authoritative within the church. Hi everyone, Dr. John Bergsma from the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology and the Franciscan University of Steubenville here. And this is the second in a series of videos on why Catholic Bibles are bigger. And for this video, we're just concentrating on 3 terms that are often confused in discussions of the issue of the bigger Catholic Bible. And those 3 terms are Deuterocanonical, apocryphal, and Pseudepigraphal. So first, the term Deuterocanonical. This is really a Greek term from 2 Greek words, deutero, which means second, as in the book of the Bible, Deuteronomy, which means second giving of the law, Deuteronomos, nomos meaning law, deutero meaning second, so it's the book in which Moses gives the law for the second time in Deuteronomy chapter 5. So shares that root, deutero, second, and then canonical, which comes from the Greek word kana, which we can recognize in English because we get our word cane from this Greek root. And it harks back to the days when there were bulrushes that grew along the bank of the river, and certain species of rushes that produced a big cane in the riverbank grew to a certain standard size because that's just what the plant did. So if you went down to the riverbank and cut one of these canes, you could be pretty sure that it was fairly close to a standard size. That's how tall they grew. And you could use it as a measuring stick. And so as a result, the term canon in Greek came to refer to a measuring stick and then more generally to a standard, an authoritative standard by which other things were judged or measured. So that's the origin of our concept or our term, the biblical canon, which is the list of inspired books, because the inspired books are the measure or the rule of faith by which all things are judged. And then we get the Catholic term canonical as well derived from that, where church councils, for example, will issue canons, which is judgments or standards by which to govern the church. So getting back to this, Deuterocanonical means a second standard. And in many ways, this term is unfortunate. It was invented by a Catholic priest by the name of Sixtus of Siena in the year 1566. Now, Sixtus was an unusual figure because he was born Jewish and later converted and became a Catholic priest. And after his conversion, he engaged in a great deal of Catholic-Jewish polemics. He kind of went after the Jewish community with apologetic arguments. And Sixtus invented this term Deuterocanonical as a handy way of referring to the 7 books in the Catholic scriptures which are rejected by the Jewish community. And those 7 books are Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, the unfortunate character of the term Deuterocanonical is it makes it sound like these 7 books are secondary or substandard in their inspiration or somehow less important theologically. So let us clarify. For Catholics and within the Catholic Church, the Deuterocanonical books are not second-class citizens. They do not have a secondary status of inspiration, and they are not theologically less important than the so-called proto-canonical books. So Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, they are fully inspired, just like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they are theologically authoritative within the church. So in several ways, Deuterocanonical is an unfortunate term. However, the options are not appealing. The most accurate thing to call these 7 books would be those canonical books rejected by Jews and Protestants. But that produces the terrible acronym Tikba-Rebajap, which is never going to catch on. So we are left with the term Deuterocanonical. So to sum up, Deuterocanonical refers to those 7 books rejected outside the Catholic Church, but accepted within the Catholic Church. And there's also the noun Deuterocanon, which would refer to the collection of those books. The term is also borrowed by Eastern churches. And in the East, the Deuterocanon is a little bit larger. For example, Greek Orthodox would also add, aside from the books accepted by the Catholic Church, Psalm 151, as well as 3rd and 4th Maccabees, 2 additional books. And some of the other Eastern, or sometimes we call them Oriental churches, have even larger Deuterocanons. For example, the Ethiopic Orthodox accept the books of Jubilees and 1st Enoch, which are largely rejected outside of Ethiopic Orthodoxy. So that is the meaning and significance of the term Deuterocanonical and the noun Deuterocanon. The second term we're going to deal with is the term apocryphal, which again comes from Greek, consisting of 2 Greek roots, apo, which means away, at least in some contexts, and crypto, which means hidden. So apocryphal means something that is hidden away. And this is a distinction that goes back to the time of the Church Fathers, what we call the patristic era, where a very strong distinction was made between canonical books, which are inspired by God and serve as a measuring stick of doctrine, versus apocryphal books, which were hidden away. And that was quite literally the case, as the canonical books would be read publicly in worship. They would be read at Mass, and they would be proclaimed as the word of the Lord, thanks be to God, etc. Whereas the apocryphal books were kept, reserved in the church library, and they were read by priests and by scholars, maybe even by enterprising laymen, but they were not proclaimed in public worship. Now, the Apocrypha is not the same as the Deuterocanon. The Deuterocanon are the 7 books that are fully canonical, fully inspired, and received by the Catholic Church, whereas apocryphal books are not canonical at all. The problem is, what you mean by apocryphal or the Apocrypha really depends on your confessional position. That is to say, what religious tradition you belong to. So if you're Catholic, the Deuterocanon is those 7 books that we mentioned, Wisdom, Sirach, Tobit, Judith, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. But then you would consider 1st Enoch, Jubilees, the Shepherd of Hermas, etc. as apocryphal books. If you are Greek Orthodox, you would include in your canon 3rd and 4th Maccabees, whereas Catholics would consider those to be apocryphal, and so on. So just as with the Deuterocanon, what you consider the term to mean depends on where you are situated ecclesiastically. Now, one of the great causes of confusion with the term Apocrypha is that the Anglican Church, or English Christianity, going back to the King James Version of the Bible, had a practice of printing the Catholic Deuterocanonical books in their Bibles, but then labeling it as the Apocrypha. And you can still purchase books published like this. I, in fact, have a much beloved older Bible, which is a revised standard version with Apocrypha, it says. And it was my first Catholic Bible. It wasn't really a Catholic Bible, but my first Bible that I used when I converted to Catholicism, because it had those additional books. But it was actually published by Protestants. So again, the term apocryphal refers to non-canonical books, and what you consider to be non-canonical depends on what religious communion you belong to. Interestingly, the term apocryphal also applies to the New Testament. because there are New Testament apocryphal books. Now, when we're dealing with the New Testament, usually issues are cleaner cut because Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, and Catholics all agree on the canon of the New Testament. They all affirm the same 27 books. So when we're dealing with the New Testament, there is no New Testament Deuterocanon. There are no New Testament books accepted by some Christian communities, but not others. We're all agreed there. But there is a New Testament Apocrypha, that is to say, a collection of rejected books. So if you start digging around, you'll find that there are dozens of false gospels that circulated in antiquity, as well as false epistles and other kinds of New Testament-ish writings that were not accepted as inspired by the church, but circulated in antiquity. And sometimes we have large amounts of text from these writings that are still extant, that is to say, still available. And you can buy printed editions of the New Testament Apocrypha, for example, on Amazon and read some of these ancient writings that were rejected. The third term that we're going to tackle is pseudepigraphal. Once more, from two Greek roots, pseudo, which means false, and epigraph, which means an inscription. So these are falsely inscribed, or we would say nowadays falsely ascribed books. Books that are attributed to authors who did not, in fact, write them. Another way of looking at the term is to consider it to mean a false writing. So the book claims to be from St. Peter, for example, but Peter, in fact, did not write it. And in fact, there are many pseudepigraphal gospels as well as epistles in the New Testament context. Now, the term pseudepigrapha is sometimes used as a synonym of apocrypha, but they do not mean the same thing. Let me try to illustrate. So, for example, if you're a Catholic or a Protestant, you might consider the book 4th Maccabees to be apocryphal in the sense that it should be hidden away, it's not canonical, it's not inspired. But you would not call it pseudepigraphal because the book makes no claims about its own authorship, much less a false claim. Now, when we're dealing with the Deuterocanonical books of the Catholic Church, if you are a Protestant, for example, you might argue that the book of Baruch is pseudepigraphal because you don't accept its claim to be from the historical person Baruch. But you can't accuse a book like Sirach of being pseudepigraphal because it does not make any false claims about its authorship. You might say it's apocryphal, but you can't call it pseudepigraphal. So again, that's the distinction in terms. Deuterocanonical means these books rejected outside the Catholic Church. Apocryphal means hidden away or non-canonical, non-authoritative. And a pseudepigraphal book is falsely attributed. It makes a false claim of authorship.